Mr. Raymond Chong is a social rights advocate cum historian who has looked far into both the history of his ancestors and the history of social rights and politics. We spent a morning with him to gain a better understanding of the history of the United States, the roots of civil rights, the pattern that history holds over the present, and what we can do as a society to combat systemic racism, stereotyping, and prejudice. Firstly, we asked him to share a little about his life and the lives of his ancestors. Here's what he had to say.
I am Meilan with the Oregon Chinese Coalition, here as part of our oral history interview project, where we interview real people with real stories in order to gain a better understanding of the Chinese American community here in the Portland area. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Meilan.
Let's just get right into it. Could you share a little bit about yourself?
Well, my name is Raymond Douglas Chong, Zheng Weiming. That's my American name and my Chinese name. Myself, I'm a sixth generation American-born Chinese. My family's been here since 1849. I have lived in Los Angeles, Oakland, Sugar Land, now in Portland since December 2019. My profession is a civil engineer. I work for the Oregon Department of Transportation here in Portland, Oregon. I've been a professional since 1977, graduated from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, got my master's from San Jose State University in 1988. So I have an abundance of professional experience, but I have more cultural experience now.
So let's start from the very beginning of your life. Where did you grow up and live, and how were you educated?
Well, I grew up in a neighborhood near downtown Los Angeles, near Chinatown, near Little Tokyo, along the Los Angeles River, in a neighborhood, a Hispanic barrio or neighborhood. It was known as Elysian Valley, or a nickname, Frogtown, because there were many frogs crawling around. So there were a lot of frogs from the river, so we call it Frogtown. And I attended Doris Place Elementary School, Irving Junior High School, and Marshall High School. So that was my time living in Los Angeles during the heyday of the Los Angeles Dodgers, the Los Angeles Lakers, the Los Angeles Rams, USC Trojans. That was my realm, my world, next to Hollywood. All the stars, television, radio, film, newspaper. I was there. That was my world in Los Angeles.
What was your experience as an Asian American when you were growing up? And what was your relationship to being Asian American as you were younger?
At that time, this is in the 60s and 70s, there was no such term as Asian. We were either Chinese, Japanese, Filipino. We were all separate groups, tribes, or clans. And my world was connected vaguely to Chinatown and also Little Tokyo, with the restaurants, the stores, and all the gatherings, the events we had together, the banquets. So that was my connection to the community. Very vaguely, but I was pretty distant. I was more white-centric than Chinese-centric at that time.
How did what you felt about being Chinese compare to how other people in the U.S. felt about Chinese people while you were growing up?
This was the time, my growing years was during the Cold War. At the same time, the Vietnam War was occurring too. And I was whitewashed in the media. I hated being Chinese. I hated Red China. I thought Red China was a fireplace, primitive, radical. I wanted to be American. I was really whitewashed. All my teachers growing up were Anglo-Americans. All the books I had, the history book, the textbooks, English, were all white-centric. So that was my mindset. I hated the gibberish of Chinese. I hated the Cantonese. When I heard it, I kind of cringed. I hated being Chinese because I was not white.
How did you begin changing your mindset towards your Chinese roots?
I got involved in my later part of my life in Oakland. I got engaged with the Oakland Chinatown community. And this is around 1988 after I got my master's degree from San Jose State University. Got involved in different community groups. I was the leader in charge of the first Miss Oakland Chinatown pageant. That was my exposure to the world of glamour and glitz in Oakland Chinatown in particular. Eventually, I had a call for community service, and I started my own nonprofit organization called the Oakland Asian Student Educational Services, tutorial, training, leadership, computer training to the South Asian kids, the Chinese kids, Vietnamese. For 10 years, I was the president, the founder. So that's when I got involved in Oakland Chinatown.
Now, your family has obviously had a very long history in America. How connected were you to like your family history back then?
From my birth to January 30th, 2003, I only had pictures in shoeboxes. My father, my mother, my grandparents never talk about the past. It was I learned later, it was a shame to talk about the dark sins, the dark crime, the dark situation they had to face in America. So I knew nothing about the paper son, the paper father, the Chinese confession program. I didn't even know about the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act until years later. They didn't teach us in school about it. There were so many dark evils against the Chinese at that time.
Now, what changed in January of 2003?
It was a Thursday afternoon in Monterey, in California, in a bungalow. My dear friend, John Thomas Killip, went to the bathtub, put a handgun, and killed himself. Upon being notified of his death, my whole paradigm of life changed. I was pursuing the American dream, family, house, career. But then, after that, I took an inner journey into my roots, both in America and in China. And up to that point, all I knew, my grandpas, my grandmas, they were here, but I knew nothing about their history, their legacy, and also the struggles and sacrifice to bring us here to Gold Mountain, America at that time. So after that date, in 2003, I began a journey from nothing, a blank canvas, knowing now I have a rich tapestry of my family history and legacy, both in America and in China.
Now, where did you begin connecting with your family tree?
It began my journey back as a fallen leaf in November 2007 when I went back to the village, to the village of Dragon Hill in Hoi Ping. That was a place where I met my relatives, went to the ancestor hall, the ancestor home, and discovered their stories. They knew about me all these years as I was being born, growing up, and graduating from school. They all knew about me. I never knew about them until the moment I met them in November 2007. And a year later, I found they gave me called the family tree book, or Jupu, Z-U-P-U, and that was when I got into the generations of my ancestors, forefathers in particular, into the village since 1506 AD. That the line, roughly 45 generations of my clan in that village. So I took a deeper dive and got more into that history back further beyond that to actually a total of 158 generations to Hongdi to 2007-10 BC. I go back. Well, before January 2003, I only knew my fathers, my parents, my mom and dad, my grandparents, and that was it. And after that, I began to unfold slowly the next generation, and then the next generation, then the railroad worker, the gold miner, and back to the village. It was a slowly unfolding history for me.
What was your experience while researching your family tree? What were you feeling as you were discovering this new information?
I was very young in terms of trying to find my genealogy, my history, my legacy. I had no roadmap. I had no living relatives that share. I had to look at the records, compile interviews, stories, and develop a coherent situation where I came from, back in America and back into China. It was quite challenging, but my first piece was back in 2009 when I did my initial story at that time about my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. But then after that, I found more about my great-great-grandfather and then my great-great-great-grandfather later.
Where did the journey of your ancestors begin in America?
It began during the height of the California Gold Rush around 1849 when Raymond Chong, my great-great-great-grandfather, arrived from Hong Kong on a clipper ship to the first city, San Francisco, to go to the gold fields in the Central Valley and the Sierra Nevada around 1849, 174 years ago.
What do you think drove so many members of your family to immigrate to America?
The driving force was Gold Mountain, Gamsung, the land of riches, the land of gold. And at the time, our China, was in a chaotic situation, civil war, starvation, famine, drought, typhoons, a lot of ills. This was the part of the century of humiliation for China because it was being encroached by all the imperial powers. And the only hope was beyond China, outside the world, into Gold Mountain, whether it's America, Canada, or Australia. There was the steady wave of sojourners in the diaspora to find the gold eagles, the gold pieces to bring back home.
How successful were your ancestors in finding these riches that were apparently found in the Gold Mountains?
It depends which version of the story. For the gold miner, he got some money, he did okay, brought it back home. It was my great-great-grandfather who came from 1865 to 1869 for the Trans-Continental Railroad, the first one, from Sacramento to Parliamentary Summit in Utah. He did okay, and he married his second wife because of that, because the tradition, if you did it well, with fortune, you have your first wife, you left the first time, but when you have your gold pieces or gold eagles, say, hey, I'm a rich man, I can build a villa, I can also have a second wife, or third, whatever. So he was somewhat successful, but the true successful entrepreneur was my great-grandfather, Raymond Chong, who arrived here in America in 1891 into Boston. And in Boston, Chinatown, he found his riches in the heart of the Chinese community, Chinatown, which was really insular, a bachelor society. But his technique of being rich was capitalism, enterprise in gambling and opium. We Chinese were always considered to be second class or inferior. We were the heathen, or the devils, or the perpetual foreigner, or the yellow pearl. Because we were dressed differently, our food was different, our traditions were different. So we were always stereotyped to be the dreaded perpetual foreigner. We were not equally respected with our civil rights until into the 20th century. we were just inferior, mistreated. There were so many stereotypes against us Chinese at that time.
Have you also discovered like more of your family in China? And if you have, can you tell us a bit about their stories and how their lives have kind of like evolved?
Well, in my case, going back to 158 generations back in China, there have been assorted civil servants, mandarins, and so forth. But it's so long, comprehensive, it's hard for me to fathom that because it goes centuries and centuries. I can picture it here in America, a little bit that in the early, more recent 19th, 20th century. But beyond that, I'm still trying to learn what transpired in China, in particular from 1506 onward. And basically, it's just living in a farm village with fish ponds, banana groves, rice fields. Very simple, very focused. Nothing grand like in the big cities of Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangzhou. He was basically out in the countryside. But when I go there, in my mind, that is paradise.
So obviously some of your family has gone to America while others did not. How did the experiences like differ between those who left China and those who were able to stay?
Those who left China were the fortunate ones who had connections, who were able to pay their shipping, travel, get to America, get in the contract, having the right connection, and hopefully finding their success in America in some shape or form. And some were successful, but very few in general were okay, make some money, but they were not really successful because the white Americans did not allow them. They were stereotyped to do laundries, restaurants, and stores. They were limited to do manual work. We were not allowed to own land. We were segregated in Chinatown. We were discriminated. We were massacred, hung, lynched, whatever. So our treatment was equal or same or worse to our brethren, African Americans, Negroes, our Hispanic brothers, the Mexicans, our Native Americans, Indians. If you look in the course of time, we've been mistreated, but look in the whole picture, many people of color has been constantly, consistently, incessantly mistreated in our America, Kuomintang.
How did people get here like illegally since you mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is where I'm assuming they didn't let like more Chinese immigrants come here. So yeah.
There were basically the Chinese was being creative. One was illegally going over the border. That's number one. The other way was more cleaner, was to assume identity of persons claiming that I am the son of this gentleman, that we live this village, we know all the family, I know where the village market is, where the school is located, I know the topography of the village itself. You would buy that paper to be claimed that I am the son. Most likely it was the son. There were very few paper daughters. It tends to be the priority at that time, very masculine centric. So it was paper father, paper son. There were very few that given that right. So it was precious to have that piece of paper to be a paper son.
That's incredible that like even though there were so many obstacles, they were still able to like immigrate to America in search of the American dream.
Yes, like my great-grandfather, he assumed somebody else's identity, most likely. Same thing for my grandfather, he assumed someone else's identity. And my father, even though he's all with the same village, assumed my uncle's identity as his son. So it was a very strategic effort to keep the migration, to keep coming to Kumsan.
What would have happened if they were discovered that it wasn't like a legitimate paper document?
The fear was legitimately they would be deported and maybe under interrogation by the official, they may disclose this guy is also a paper son. So people would be at risk of being deported themselves, part of the scheme. And that happened later in the 50s and 60s during the Chinese confession program in exchange for citizenship. Tell me who are the real people. Is this your uncle or real? Who is connected? There's a lot of tension among the Chinese community. Who was telling the family secrets at that time?
Did many people like participate in that confession program?
Yes, many.
Oh.
It was very harsh time. Not because of the Cold War, of the Korean War, when China and America fought from 1950 to 1953. The Chinese were considered the enemy because we, the Chinese, the communists, fought with the Americans. So they wanted to make sure we were real Americans.
Through all of this like attack, what was this like American dream that kept so many people like coming into America?
Well, the American dream is a lofty idea, and I'm going to repeat that. The dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. To translate to now in 2023 is we're giving equal opportunity to live a better life depending on your hard work. As long as you do have all these different factors, ingredients, you will achieve your American dream. But solely depending on your drive, your energy, your vision. That is the American dream. And there is no single American dream. Each of us have an American dream. My son, he's pursuing his American dream in Hollywood as a filmmaker. So
Wow.
that each of them could be yours. And your American dream would be a star, a Hollywood star.
Maybe not. Do you think your family was able to find their own American dreams eventually?
In their own way, yes. For my father, his American dream was to see my brother, my baby brother, and myself graduate from college, from the University of Southern California. My brother, California Institute of Technology. That was, he saw it. He saw us graduate proudly. That was his American dream for our graduation, before he died in 1979.
I think that's a good place to end my two sections of this interview. Thank you for having us here for my sections. We still have two more sections to go,
Okay.
but
谢谢。
不客气。
We continued our interview, this time conversing about the history of the United States and the current situation we find ourselves in today.
1619, when the first African slaves were imported into America in Jamestown, in Virginia. That set the tone. It was the white imperial powers of Europe controlling, acquiring the land from the Native Americans. It was that mindset. And it was the French, the British, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, all doing that. And fast forward to our America, and to today, our Independence Day, 1776, the lofty goals of America, our American democracy, was subscribed back then in 1776. But looking at the true reality, it's always been white dominated, white control, white managed. And the first telling sign is in our own Constitution in 1790, where you could be only a citizen if you're a white heritage. No African, no Hispanic, no Asian. And that set the tone over time, leading into the 19th century, where the focus was America was driven by the manifest destiny. It was righteous from the East Coast into the Northwest, into the interior, past the Mississippi River, into America West, to possess, to dominate, to monopolize the land from the Native Americans who were there for many centuries, and to justify their massacres, their slaughter, their assimilation, their relocation of the tribes. And that set the tone of racism, that they were justified to slaughter, to control the Indian, because they were inferior class, second class, because the white European race was righteous. And that led to the situation in Oregon, eventually with the massacres. Then eventually, Oregon was founded as the white utopia, that it was an idyllic land for white pioneers to live. And that continued with the practice of excluding Negroes, blacks, Africans since 1859 here in Oregon. And then for the Chinese, we were the early pioneers from Asia, and all the torment, the torture, all that we had to face because we were the heathens, the perpetual foreigner, the Chinaman, as I would say that, and that we were discriminated, harassed, everything, prejudice, and all of that. And then looking back for the Chinese in particular, we were segregated into Chinatown. There's old Chinatown on the other side of Burnside, and the new Chinatown, because we were redlined, because we could not own land. And then in 1887, at Hills Canyon, near Idaho, 34 Chinese gold miners were slaughtered, their bodies thrown in the river, and nobody got convicted of that crime. So it was a continuation of that. For the Mexicans, they came here as farm workers back around 1910, but they've always been treated second class, primitive living conditions, and when they did not need it, they're deported back to Mexico. They're herded in gangs, thrown in tanks or campers or whatever, and just deported back to Mexico like animals. They did twice in the 1930s and 1950s, 2 periods. There were many laws discriminated against people of color, especially in 1923, when people who could be eligible for citizenship could not own land in Oregon. That was aimed in particular against the Japanese and Chinese. We were targeted. And now, fast forward 100 years later, same thing happening. The next wave of alien land law acts against supposedly the enemies of America, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, those North Koreans, those are enemies. So history is repeating itself because of ignorance. That is the danger.
Do you think racism is expressed in a different manner today than it has been in past years?
Yes, in terms of being manipulated, but still being controlled, that the white elites still are in charge. That is subtle, sophisticated. Like in Texas, they're changing the voting rights in sophisticated ways to diminish the rights of people of color. So that only most of the dominant white people will vote, and therefore people of color are disencouraged to vote. Back in the Jim Crow laws of the Deep South of the 60s and before that, people need to collaborate, cooperate, coordinate, and have an understanding, appreciation of all the cultures, of their needs and wants, and not be in silos, not be in islands. We should be one united nation, respecting each other. That is important. And to have an understanding and not be in silos where you're isolated in islands. You don't have this sense of understanding or appreciation of culture. I have all kinds of friends, from Jews to Africans to Mexicans to Asians to Anglo. I'm very open-ended. When I go out in the community, I meet all people, the blue collar, white collar. I always ask them, not where you come from, not who are you, what are you. I ask them, what is your story? And it's amazing. I learned so much, whether from Nigeria, from Venezuela, from Malaysia. I know their story as fellow Americans, not a distant caricature or stereotype. It's an open-ended question. What I see is a common thread with whites and people of color is family is the primacy, is supreme. Family. And we share our family stories with their family stories. It's always a common root, a common sharing. But I think family is one approach to unify. Family is a unifying force for us Americans.
On an individual level, how else do you think we can combat racism and embrace others?
Well, there's a way to, we call, resist racism, and these are the tools, the resistance tool. One is creation, making something, creating an organization like the Organized Chinese Coalition. It's one example for our cause. One celebration, like the Autumn Moon Festival, or the Lunar New Year Parade, or festival, or the Dragon Boat Race. Another one is, as I mentioned, persistence, following your vision for a mission to achieve your American dream in the face of struggle and sacrifice. Protest, being out on the street peacefully, advocating and championing your cause for your like-minded brothers and sisters. Another thing is having an organization and advocate politically for your rights to vote, for your rights for civil rights in organization. And then lastly is reformation, being part of the legislative branch of making the laws. You are reforming the laws to reverse, to end the unjust laws, in particular against Asians, Africans, Natives, Hispanics, Jews. You can do it within the system as a legislature or ultimately in Congress. So those are the tools of resistance to combat racism. But the key is engaging with people. Do not be distant. Talk with people. Do things together. Do not be disconnected.
With the primary portion of our interview finished, we joined Raymond in a three-way conversation to talk about his life and experiences. You mentioned that you lived in a barrio for the earlier parts of your life,
Yes.
your childhood.
Yes.
How was that experience? What were the people that you met?
Well, it was all Mexican dominated, and I was in tune of their culture, their music, their cuisine, their habits. You know, I got to learn a little Spanish, a little barrio slang, like vato, cholo, which means gangsters. That was the world. I mean, we had very sprinkling of very Chinese family here, maybe Japanese there, maybe Filipino, but it was very dominated Mexican. Everywhere I went beyond Chinatown was Hispanic, Lincoln Heights, where we did our shopping. That was my realm around that.
So you didn't really have like a community with like a bunch of other like people that looked like you, basically?
It was only when I went to Chinatown when I had that. Beyond inside my barrio, it was, I would say, 90% Hispanic. And in my classroom, was sprinkling, not all Chinese, but one Filipino here, a couple of Chinese there, maybe Japanese. But we didn't think ourselves as Asians. That was not a fashionable term back in the 60s. When they see me, they see another Chinaman. Very stereotypical. But once I open my mouth and smile and engage with them, you can see the mindset change. So it's important to have a dialogue, to engage.
How do you think is the best way to go about like connecting with people by breaking down like some barriers they may have like against having new experiences, I guess?
It is the art of communication. Knowing with some emotional intelligence, that profile that individual, and find some common issues or concerns or ideas, and have that conversation, and have that intent, true intent to know them, not a superficial way, but know deeply into their mind, their soul and heart, deeply, and more truthfully. That's the key. Not very superficial, but more engaged if they're open to it. But if they resist, respect that too, because they may be very shy, or not as talkative, but it takes time to break those barriers. It's one step at a time. It won't be instantaneous. It takes effort if you want to sustain that opportunity to have good relationships. Each person has their own narrative, but we can bind it by the people. It's singular, very focused. But in America, there's so many stories because it's a merging of many peoples. There's no singular track. Whereas in China, it's pretty straightforward, unless you're Cantonese or Mandarin. But in general, other countries, it's one track. It's America trying to blend it together and synthesize it together.
What impact do you want to leave on this world?
The impact is positive, with optimism. The next generation and the generation after that, my descendants, my son's kids and his kids, follow their own American dream and have a great and better society in peace, not in civil war, not in hatred or discrimination or prejudice, but a all-inclusive, equitable, and diverse world that we can live as brothers and sisters. Simple as that. That's the ideal realm that Dr. Martin Luther King, in his vision that was cut short in 1968.
Do you think we've gotten any closer to achieving his vision, or are we kind of going backwards?
We're still moving forward in that vision, but now I'm seeing a sad trend of reversals, whether through the state legislature, through Congress, or the Supreme Court. It's a little subtle, but that momentum may shift unless there is that movement of protests, of resistance to come again. You can't be complacent. Because I noticed before the past 2 or 3 years, most of the Chinese coming from back home, the next generation, they're only concerned about money. They don't care about the law. They don't care about the institutional racism. Not me. They don't know anything about the African. They don't know about the Mexicans. They don't know nothing about the Indian. All it's make money, make money. And that's a sad testimony. Hopefully they have their day of reckoning since COVID in the past 3 years. Hey, they consider us the enemy. Why? We make good money. That's not good enough. They can take our rights. They can appropriate our bank account, our land, our property. Is it clear and present danger if you're complacent that it's money, money, money? We all have an American dream, and it's very complex, it's very diverse. There's no single American dream, but we should be one united America, and it's a little ironic on this Independence Day, in celebration of the greatness of America, America democracy is still the great experiment. It has not been fully tested yet. It needs to be formulated, trial, engage, involve. This is the American democracy that we should be united as one people under one flag. So this is our American democracy, where there is no racism, no discrimination, no harassment, no hatred, no prejudice. That is the one America that we ideally should strive together as Americans.
Thank you so much for your spending your time with us here. You've given us a lot of invaluable information. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Brian. 谢谢。
谢谢。